We are very pleased that today we can offer the MS community current information on the COVID-19 vaccine and the guidance to date for people affected by MS. My name is Johanna Green, and I'm the Director of Partnerships here at the MS Society of Canada, and I am very happy to be moderating this webinar. A few housekeeping notes. The webinar is being recorded for future viewing on our YouTube channel. No participant names or identifying information is being displayed. If you have a question during the presentation, please type it into the chat box on your screen. We'll have a Q&A session after our speaker presents. We're also streaming live to Facebook, so hello to all of our Facebook Live viewers. Your questions are also welcome. We know there are many questions regarding MS and COVID-19 as we approach 1 year since the onset of the pandemic in Canada. As the COVID-19 vaccine is being rolled out, we've engaged Dr. Jody Burton to share some updates and information with you today. Please recognize, however, that there's a lot of information still in development, and there are some questions that simply cannot be answered at this time. Additionally, questions better answered by an infectious disease specialist may not be addressed in this session. However, we will gather these questions for a future response where possible. Finally, we suggest contacting your healthcare professional for questions pertaining to specific personal situations. The MS Society does not approve, endorse, or recommend any specific product or therapy, but provides information to assist individuals in making their own decisions. So let's get right to what you're all here for. I am very excited to introduce Dr. Jody Burton. Dr. Burton obtained her Bachelor of Science in Life Sciences in 1996 and her MD in 2000 at the University of Toronto. She then undertook a neurology residency at the University of Toronto, which she completed in 2005. She spent the next 2 years in an MS fellowship with Dr. Paul O'Connor and obtained her Master of Science in Clinical Epidemiology from 2006 to 2008. She was on staff at the MS Clinic at the University of Toronto from 2007 to 2009 until she joined the Department of Clinical Neurosciences and the MS program, as well as the Department of Community Health Sciences at the University of Calgary. Dr. Burton is currently an associate professor and a full member of the MS research program at the University of Calgary's Hotchkiss Brain Institute. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Burton.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm going to share my screen now so that I can get my slides ready. All right. Okay. And again, thank you so much, and we'll be handling questions after. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, we're going to start. These are just my disclosures. And I've been a consultant and received honoraria and unrestricted educational support from Roche, Novartis, Alexion, and Biogen. So we're going to start talking a little bit about the virus itself. So the virus itself is actually the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and the illness it causes is COVID-19. And this virus belongs to the coronavirus family of viruses, and you may remember the SARS outbreak in 2003, and that was a coronavirus, and the Middle Eastern respiratory virus that occurred later. This is a highly transmissible virus, and as we are all aware, unfortunately, it has a fairly high fatality rate when compared to the flu. Transmission is actually mostly through asymptomatic carriers, and when symptoms develop, it's often in the 5 to 10 to 14-day window after exposure. And the most common early symptoms are cough, fever, and shortness of breath, but other symptoms can be seen, such as sore throat, diarrhea, delirium, and even conjunctivitis, which is actually more common in children. And the disease was originally thought perhaps just to impact the respiratory system, but it's become abundantly clear that other organ systems are involved, such as the nervous system, when people lose their sense of taste and smell, the vascular system, where people develop clots and strokes, and the cardiac system, and you can get inflammation of various structures in the heart. And this is just a little diagram of the virus, and as you can see, you see these little spikes on the outside of the virus, and that's a very important feature the virus will get to. And so there are known risk factors in terms of who has potentially a poorer outcome if they are infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. We know advanced age is a risk factor. It appears that male gender is also a risk factor. Obesity is a risk factor, and so are various other chronic diseases such as kidney disease, diabetes, lung disease, and people who have disorders where they're very immune suppressed. We know that people who have a fair degree of disability for whatever reason appear to be at greater risk. But we've learned, and I'll go over this, that MS by itself is not an independent risk factor of a poorer outcome. And in fact, it appears that patients who are on disease-modifying therapies may in fact have a better prognosis than those who are not, with some caveats. So let's talk a little bit about this illness in people with MS. And there was a large registry done out of multiple centers in France that was published in the fall of 2020. And they studied almost 350 patients in their registry who developed a COVID-19 infection, who also had a diagnosis of MS with various subtypes. And I'll go over these images with you. And the first image on top shows how people did based on what type of MS they had. And so the top row is people who required hospitalization and may have actually died due to the COVID-19 infection. And what you can see there is a reasonable percentage of those people had a progressive form of MS. Whereas in the group that didn't require hospitalization, those people were more represented by people with CIS, the first presentation, or relapsing remitting MS. And when they studied groups, they found that men appeared to do worse in the MS cohort. Obese patients appeared to do worse in the MS cohort. People who had cardiac disease appeared to do worse. And people whose disability scores were relatively high appeared to do worse compared to those who had a small degree of disability. And that kind of matches up with the risk factors I showed you in the slide earlier in the entire general population. These pictures show a little bit of a different approach to this group of patients. And what you'll see on the vertical axis is different outcomes, with the worst outcome being on the top, which is death, and the best outcome, which is not requiring any hospitalization or being unwell, on the bottom. And what you see in the rows are the numbers of patients on various treatments for MS. And what you can see in the top row, although thankfully it's a small row representing a small number of patients, is death occurred mostly in people who weren't on any form of disease-modifying therapy. Whereas when we get down to the lower rows, which are people who didn't do too badly, we see a variety of different MS medications. And on the bottom picture on the graph, we see a similar representation where people who had no treatment had several people within the group, which is the dark bars, who did poorly and had a bad outcome. Whereas when we get into the people on a variety of therapies here in these other bars, we have people on treatments, and there were a sizable number of people who had a decent outcome and not a severe outcome. And the take-home message from this study was that the same risk factors in the general population seem to apply to the MS population, and being on treatment for these medications was not a risk factor, and in fact, perhaps appeared to correlate with doing better. And so the question is, well, why? Why did that pattern emerge? Well, it's possible that people on medication for MS are perhaps younger and less disabled than people who are not on medications. Perhaps they're earlier in their disease. There's more relapsing remitting patients, and so there's less disability in that group. It's also possible that people on DMTs, those medications may modulate their immune system. And it's possible that if your immune system is modulated, that you don't have a massive immune response to the virus. And we know that some people do poorly with the virus, not because of the direct infection, but because their immune system has such an extreme reaction to it, it attacks other parts of their body. And so possibly being on a medication for MS makes that less likely to happen. There's also some evidence that at least one of the medications used to treat MS, which is teriflunomide, also known as Aubagio, has some antiviral properties which might perhaps be helpful. And so that's very encouraging. That being said, there has been some information from other registries that have found there may be some risk associated with a few of the therapies used in MS, which we call B-cell therapies. And the one that's used in MS that's most common is ocrelizumab or Ocrevus. And this was a study from a registry of several centers that was presented last fall. And what they found was this group over here on the left are people not on any treatment. And what you see these numbers are, these are relative risks. And when the number is higher than 1, it means the risk is greater than the average. And people on no treatment had a greater risk of needing the ICU and needing a ventilator. But there also appeared to be an increased risk of those outcomes in people on Ocrevus and a drug similar to Ocrevus called rituximab, which we don't use very often in North America for MS. Now, other centers have not found that relationship, so it's not clear that that is a definite link between that drug and having a more significant outcome if you acquire COVID, but it's something we're watching. Of interest, the risk of actually dying from COVID was not greater even in the group that needed the hospitalization. So a little bit about the current vaccines that are approved in Canada. And right now there are 2 vaccines approved in Canada, and they both belong to the mRNA class of vaccines. And there's the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. And these work in a very interesting way. And what they do is they take a small piece of RNA, which is genetic material that codes for proteins. And this particular piece of RNA codes for that spike protein I mentioned before, which is on the surface of the virus. Now, the spike itself is harmless, but it does distinguish this virus from any other part of your body. And this RNA enters the body, but it doesn't go anywhere near your DNA and it doesn't change your DNA. But it does spur your cells to start making this protein for the spike protein. And ultimately, the cell displays this spike protein on the outside while the RNA degrades and disappears. And your body sees the spike protein and realizes that's not a normal part of you, and it needs to mount an immune response against it because it's foreign. And so that the next time that your immune system sees that spike protein, it will mount an immune response and neutralize it. So there are 2 vaccines that work in this fashion. The first one is the Pfizer vaccine, and the study was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, not in the year 2200, but in the year 2020. And this was a very large trial with over 40,000 participants in it, half receiving the vaccine and half receiving a placebo with a booster shot 21 days later. And in the trial, there were 8 cases of a COVID-19 infection in the treatment group after the second shot. And that was compared to 162 cases of the infection in the placebo group. And that's how they calculated what's called the effectiveness, which is 95%. And this effect was seen across ages and races and genders and ethnicities and body size. There were 10 cases of severe COVID requiring intervention, and only one of these was in the treatment group. And so this is very impressive. And so this vaccine was approved in December. And then we have the Moderna vaccine. And the Moderna vaccine also had a very large trial with over 30,000 participants. And this vaccine is given in 2 doses, 28 days apart. And what they found was very similar. There were 5 cases of COVID in the vaccine group and 90 in the placebo group, which works out to a 94% effectiveness rate. And this also was seen across ages, gender, race, ethnicity, and people with different medical conditions. 10 people needed hospitalization for their infection, and only 1 of these was in the vaccine group. And the Moderna results suggested that it might provide some protection even against asymptomatic infection, not just illness. I know a lot of people have questions about variants, which are changing every day. It hasn't been published or proven, but there's some suggestion the mRNA vaccines show decent effectiveness against the new variants that are popping up. And then we have what are called the viral vector vaccines. And these are vaccines that basically use the cold virus, which is the adenovirus, and add a little protein to it, which is again for that spike protein, which itself is harmless, but none of the genes that allow COVID to replicate are there. And basically, it piggybacks with the cold virus and creates multiple copies of this spike protein, which again are displayed on the outside of the cell, and tell your immune system to mount a response to this because it's not a normal part of you. There are potentially a few more risks with a viral vector vaccine. They're theoretical. They haven't necessarily been shown to happen. And there aren't any clear reports from the studies as of yet about these kinds of complications. And there are 2 such vaccines. The AstraZeneca vaccine in the UK was approved in Europe. It hasn't been approved as of yet in Canada. And basically this uses a piece of the adenovirus virus, and it also encodes a bit of that spike protein. And this is also a 2-shot vaccine given 28 days apart, and it showed an efficacy of about 70%. And then we're all hearing about the Johnson Johnson vaccine, which is similar, also a very large trial. They haven't yet published the results, but it looks promising. This only requires 1 shot and doesn't require freezing. And so one of the perks of the Johnson Johnson vaccine will be the ease of rolling it out. But as of yet, these 2 vaccines are not approved in Canada. So let's just talk a bit about MS and vaccines in general, because there's a long history of concern about the relationship between these 2. A lot of old vaccine recommendations are simply not based in evidence, and they've kind of been perpetuated over the decades. MS is not a disease where you're immunosuppressed, and I think that's a common misunderstanding. If anything, MS is an immune system that's too active and active against the wrong things. People with MS and who are using MS medications are not truly severely immunosuppressed in the same way we think about people on chemotherapy. They do have a changed immune system, and they may be more vulnerable to certain things. There's no solid evidence at all that vaccines can cause someone to develop MS or can create true MS relapses. Vaccines can give you a fever and make you transiently feel unwell, as anybody who's gotten a flu shot knows. And we know that MS patients who get a fever can sometimes have what we call pseudo symptoms, where the increased body temperature aggravates existing symptoms. Commonly, people experience this when they get a bladder infection. And typically, this is just treated with acetaminophen and time. The bigger issue is how does an MS patient's medication possibly impact their response to vaccine? And one of the caveats that we still typically go by is we don't really use live vaccines while people with MS are on medications, just because there is the possibility of some infection and perhaps a limited response to the vaccine. So if you're on a medication for MS and you need a live vaccine, we'll typically hold your medication. That being said, none of the current contenders for the COVID illness vaccines are live. And I don't think we're going to see one. So what's the bottom line? So based on what we know about vaccines and people with MS, is it reasonable to assume that the SARS-CoV-2 mRNA vaccines are no more risky than other non-live vaccines? Yes, I think it's safe to assume that. Based on the risk of catching SARS-CoV-2 and all the complications, do we recommend MS patients get vaccinated with the understanding that they've confirmed with their provider that they don't need to adjust their medication? Yes, we do. Are there some MS patients who are going to need to discuss adjusting their schedule of their medication to maximize their vaccine response? Yes, there are. And will people with MS outside of these pre-specified cohorts we've been hearing about, such as the advanced age cohort, will they be vaccinated before the general population? I think the answer to that is unlikely. And that's partly because there are so many groups of people who have very valid reasons for needing to be vaccinated earlier than later. And as we know, MS by itself is not a risk factor for a worse outcome from a COVID infection. And then the other question I'm often asked is, will people be able to choose which vaccine they get? And I think given our current supply issues, the answer is probably not. But that being said, all the current vaccines appear to have excellent data and have shown very excellent safety results so far. And I would encourage you to have faith in Health Canada that they're quite strict about their approval process for vaccines. A lot of people also ask, what's the minimum effectiveness to be approved as a vaccine? And currently it's typically around at least 60%. So the current question that we tend to focus on is, well, how do we coordinate vaccination with DMT use? And the Canadian Network of MS Clinics has been working on looking at the research, looking at the data, and trying to figure out a practical guide to MS providers about how to advise and guide their patients. This is a complicated table with a lot of technical information in it that I don't want people to get too hung up on, but I'm going to kind of summarize it a little bit for you. The first column are the current approved medications for MS. The next three columns are various vaccines that have been studied in terms of how people respond to them while on these medications. This column here is whether or not you need to hold your medication for vaccination to ensure a good vaccine response. And then the final column is our suggestion for how long you need to wait after the vaccine to resume your medication so you don't impair your response to the vaccine. And the conventional injectables that have been around for almost 30 years, so the interferon family and the glatiramer acetate family, have shown very reasonable response when people have gotten a flu vaccine or a tetanus vaccine, or over here we have diphtheria, pneumonia, and meningitis. And so we don't believe these medications need to be held before a vaccine, and therefore obviously you can continue to take them through the vaccine and beyond. Here we have our first-line oral medications. The most commonly used are teriflunomide, which is Aubagio, and dimethyl fumarate, which is Tecfidera. And they've shown reasonable response to the flu vaccine, the tetanus vaccine, and the pneumonia vaccine while people are still taking them. And so again, we don't think people need to hold these medications before they get vaccinated. The next group is the medications that go through the S1P pathway, and the current one most people are familiar with is fingolimod, which is also known as Gilenya. And there's a varying response to the flu vaccine, but it's actually pretty decent. And there's a varying response to the tetanus vaccine, but again, it's pretty decent. And we also know that if you hold somebody's fingolimod, they may have a bit of a rebound relapse phenomenon. And so we think when we put that story together, it's probably best if people continue on their fingolimod and they can get vaccinated while they're on it. Down here at the bottom, we have natalizumab or Tysabri. And again, the response to vaccination is pretty decent. And again, and even with tetanus, there's no difference when people get a tetanus vaccine between natalizumab users and controls. And so people on natalizumab don't need to hold their medications and can get vaccinated while they're taking them. And then we get into the bit of the stronger, newer groups of medications, and this is where there may need to be a little bit of coordination. This class of drugs, which we call the cell-depleting agents, covers cladribine, which is also known as Mavenclad, and alemtuzumab, which is also known as Lemtrada. And these are drugs that people only need to take potentially once a year for a couple years and perhaps not again. But because of that, they have lasting impacts on the immune system, which is part of their benefit. And we know that if you get vaccinated very close in time to a dose, you may not have a resounding response to a vaccine. But if you wait at least 3 months, potentially up to 6 months after you've gotten a dose of these medications, you should have a pretty normal response to a vaccine. And so where it's possible, we are recommending that people get their COVID vaccine at least 3 months out from a dose, and ideally about 6 months out from a dose. And about 4 weeks after they've completed their vaccine cycle, they can resume therapy if they're due. Right now, it's probably easier to adjust the timing of your alemtuzumab or cladribine than it is to adjust the timing of when you get a COVID vaccine. But we also know these drugs perhaps last a little bit longer than a year. So if it's worth talking to your provider about it if you're on them, to figure out if you do need to adjust a tiny bit so that when it's time for you to get vaccinated, you're in a good window. And then down here we have what we call the anti-CD19 or 20 monoclonal antibody group. And those are the anti-B cell therapies. And the one people are familiar with is ocrelizumab or Ocrevus. Ofatumumab is coming, but it's not yet available for use in Canada, but it will be. And rituximab is used for a variety of immune disorders and on rare occasions in MS. And these drugs reduce certain B cell populations, and they're typically given every 6 months. And those B cell populations tend to be diminished for about 6 months, potentially longer. And so what we recommend is, if it's possible, try to have things timed so that you're as far away from your last dose of these drugs as you can be by the time you're vaccinated. That may just not be possible given what your MS is like or when you get called for vaccination. But if it's possible, try to at least put a few months between your last dose of medication and vaccine. You still might have a decent response to the vaccine, even if it turns out you need to be vaccinated close in time to a dose. And certain people do. Certain people who are on these medications are healthcare workers. And I think it's important to get vaccinated when your opportunity comes up. But if you have the luxury of tinkering a bit with your treatment schedule and you and your provider feel it's reasonable to adjust dosing a little bit if that makes the timing better, that's probably reasonable. And just like the other drugs above, about 4 weeks after you're done your last shot, you can resume therapy if you're due. And these criteria have been evolving over time as we're learning more. And I think people are nervous about, am I going to have a bad reaction to the vaccine because I'm on these drugs? The answer is no, there's no evidence of that. I think we just want to ensure that if you're vaccinated, you're going to get a decent response to this vaccine. But, you know, there are some people who have very active MS and they really can't afford to hold their medication. And it's worth talking to your MS provider about that if you're concerned, because there are other things you can do. You know, if people need to switch medications for a little while so they're on something they can stay on when the vaccine rolls around, that's okay. I think, again, it's worth talking to your MS provider if you've got concerns, and they're likely expecting your call. And I think that's perfectly reasonable. And actually, that's all the slides I have, because truthfully, this is a learning experience for us as well. And, you know, I think probably people have a lot of questions, some about the vaccine, some about MS and the vaccine, some about what's going on in Canada. And so I think what I'm going to do is turn it back over to our host and let her start letting the questions go. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen at the moment, if that's okay, and perhaps send it back to you, Johanna.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burton. Some wonderful information, and really appreciate that you've incorporated likely what are a lot of people's questions already into your presentation. That being said, questions are already coming in, and a reminder to people, if you have a question, just type it into the chat box and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible tonight. Here's the first one to kick things off, Dr. Burton. Perhaps you can tell us a bit about the group who's been working on these recommendations and information. Who's been involved? How often will the information get updated, and where can people find that information?
Well, so actually a lot of MS centers across the country have taken it upon themselves to start making recommendations and guidelines for their own patients. We have the Canadian Network of MS Clinics, which includes clinics and providers from coast to coast. And we felt it was important to have sort of a Canada-wide set of guidelines as well. And so we've been doing our research. We've corresponded with our infectious disease colleagues at our centers. We've been working with the MS Society of Canada. In fact, we've also been corresponding with our American counterparts, with the National MS Society. And so we've also got people with expertise in immunology as well. And so a lot of people have contributed to this, and these guidelines evolve almost on a week-to-week basis as new information becomes available. And so our group has been corresponding multiple times a week, actually, and these guidelines have been updated several times and may be updated even more so as even more people are vaccinated and we're learning more about the virus and, you know, real world experiences outside of trials. We've also had guidance and corresponded with the National Association for Canada Immunization, which originally put out some guidelines that I think were a bit too strict and originally suggested people with autoimmune disease and pregnant people should not be vaccinated. And after several conversations, that recommendation has changed. And so overall, most people with autoimmune diseases probably will be safer being vaccinated than not vaccinated. And again, that's a conversation that you should be having with your provider if you're concerned where you fit into that picture.
Great. Well, and clearly so much collaboration has happened, even internationally, to stay on top of the latest, and it continues to evolve. Also want to let our viewers know that ongoing updates on this topic can also be accessed and found on our MS Society website at mssociety.ca. So continue to tune in there for the latest updates on this ever-evolving issue. We'll move on to our next question. This one has a little bit of lead-up context, but I think is important for the question. No one yet knows the immediate short-term or long-term impact of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines on individuals with autoimmune diseases generally and MS specifically. However, some countries are far ahead of Canada in immunizing their citizens. This person says the best example being Israel. So it might well be possible to find out from Israeli neurologists about the immediate experience of MS patients with the first dose and with the second who have received both. The same applies, for example, to the UK, which has a robust MS program. Such information could be reassuring to MS patients in Canada. Has anyone been in touch with Israeli or UK neurologists about their immediate patient experience?
Well, I think that's an excellent point. And I want to assure viewers that there is constant international correspondence, and there are registries as well associated with all these vaccination programs. Not just registries for infection, but registries for vaccination response. It's probably a little too early to know about anything in the long term. Short-term data has not demonstrated any alarming complications about these vaccine rollouts. A lot of the short-term data is actually very reassuring. But I think it is a bit early, and I think that's a very fair question. And as we get more data and as a little bit more time passes, I think we are going to learn about how people with autoimmune disorders respond to vaccination. That being said, we have a lot of experience with other vaccines in our patients and autoimmune patients, and that is very reassuring to us that we don't anticipate any catastrophes with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. But again, we can't know until we get some more data. So it's a bit of an open question and a really good question.
Great. Our next question comes to us from one of our Facebook viewers. Is there any worry those on immunosuppressants may not launch the immune response necessary to create the antibody benefit from the vaccine?
And that's a very fair question as well. And, you know, we've looked at how the immune system functions on a variety of the classic MS medications. And a lot of trials are done when new medications enter the marketplace, typically with the flu vaccine, sometimes with tetanus, sometimes with pneumonia, because these are really important questions. And we do know that a lot of the long-standing MS therapies, including the injectables and the orals, appear to mount decent responses to the vaccines already out there: flu, tetanus, pneumonia, meningitis. People on stronger medications, such as alemtuzumab or cladribine, in the early weeks and months after a vaccine may not actually mount the full response. That being said, when we talk about vaccine response, we're talking about percentage of people, not individuals. It's possible you may mount a decent response if your vaccine dose is close in time to your MS treatment, but if you have the luxury of making that a little bit more distant, that's probably a good idea. That being said, there are always boosters. Very strong immunosuppressants aren't typically used in MS too often, except for patients who have very extreme disease, who may need off-label, very powerful medications. And I think those people may very well need to potentially time things a bit differently, but those people likely have a very knowledgeable MS provider who can give them guidance and is probably already thinking about that for their patients. And again, if you're worried about your medication impairing your vaccine response, please talk to your MS provider. As I've shown, for the most part, it's very reassuring. And, I think with the drugs where you want to time things, for the most part, we have the luxury of coordinating things so that things work out.
Great. A question from one of our French Facebook audience members. I don't take any medication and have a secondary progressive form of MS. Is it dangerous for me to get vaccinated?
So provided you don't have any other health issues that would be a concern with the vaccination, people with secondary progressive MS, who presumably are potentially a little bit older than the average cohort and potentially have a little bit more disability than the average relapsing remitting patient, I would encourage them to strongly consider getting the vaccine. And that's because we've shown that people with a little bit more disability and a little bit on the other side of the age group may be a little bit more risk of complications. And those are the people we would strongly encourage to consider taking the vaccine if offered.
Okay. Here's another question. I'm scheduled to receive the vaccine on Wednesday, and I'm scared of side effects or adverse events. Could they make my MS worse? I walk with a cane and don't need a wheelchair. Could you please reassure me?
What I would say is there's no evidence that any vaccine has ever created new MS lesions and permanent disability. You can get a fever. You can feel a little crappy after a vaccine, and we've all experienced that with a host of vaccines, from the flu to tetanus. The most common side effects from the current vaccines are a sore arm, feeling a bit lousy, like you're coming down with something, possibly mounting a little bit of a fever. And some people with MS, when they get a fever, have a transient worsening of some of their symptoms. They're not actually developing new injury to their nerves, but their nerves are sensitive to the change in body temperature. And just like when you develop a bladder infection or you catch a flu and your MS temporarily feels lousy, when you clear that illness or you recover from the vaccine irritation, you should feel okay. We do recommend people take some Tylenol if they feel a bit feverish or unwell, and not Advil. And that's just because there's some thought that maybe Advil might impact the vaccination. So if you are feeling a bit yucky after your vaccine, I would take some Tylenol and rest. And I think, in terms of when I think about the risk of COVID versus the risk of feeling a bit lousy after a vaccine, I know personally, I'd be more nervous about COVID and what it could potentially do.
Okay, good advice there. Dr. Burton, you did allude to this in your presentation, but some questions are coming in around this topic. So perhaps we'll ask you, any indication whether people with MS will be able to get the vaccine sooner than the general population on a priority basis?
Well, I'm not privy to the planning of how it's rolled out. I think everybody realizes the rollout has had some stumbles and supply has been a major issue. We know that there are certain groups that are at considerable risk of having a bad outcome from COVID. We know the elderly, we know people who live in communal living, long-term care facilities, people with chronic illnesses like bad diabetes or heart disease. We know that MS just by itself is not a risk factor to have a bad outcome. And I'm anticipating that MS will probably not be given priority status when the rollout happens. And that may just be because they can't break down into so many groups and have so many different cohorts rolling out. There are a lot of groups that have a very reasonable claim to needing the vaccine sooner than later. I think logistically, I don't expect to see MS patients go to the front of the line unless, of course, they belong to those other high-risk groups. But again, it's anybody's guess at this point what will happen when supplies become reasonable again.
Okay, fair. And I just wanted to let our audience know as well, obviously the MS Society advocates on behalf of people affected by MS. So as an organization, we have been meeting with international and national health charities to discuss this prioritization piece of the COVID vaccine in special populations. And over the coming weeks, so that everyone's aware, the MS Society will be submitting a letter to provincial and territorial governments advocating for COVID-19 vaccination prioritization for people living with MS. So yeah, advocacy efforts underway, but completely understand what you shared.
And I would say, I think if there was no limitation of supply, I would think people with MS should go ahead of the general population. I just think from a logistics point of view, I don't anticipate that's how it's actually going to happen, in spite of that being the ideal or optimal situation.
Great. Okay.
But I think it's worth pushing.
Yeah, for sure. We'll give it every effort. Another question from one of our viewers. I am on Rebif and have thankfully received the first dose of the Pfizer vaccine as I work in acute care. My doctor told me the efficacy won't be as high as quoted by the pharma company. What is the reason for the anticipated lower efficacy of the vaccine for me? Is it the MS or is it the DMT?
I don't know that I would say that you're not going to mount a reasonable response to the vaccination if you're on Rebif. I don't think there's data that suggests you have a blunted response. There isn't data that will tell me what type of response you'll have, but based on other vaccination studies, it doesn't appear people on Rebif are at a great risk of not responding to vaccination. So I'm not sure you need to worry about that. Now, obviously, a drug monograph has to meet certain standards, but in the real world, it doesn't appear people on Rebif don't have a decent response to the various vaccines that are already available, flu vaccine, hepatitis vaccine, and we don't hold Rebif when people do get vaccinated. So I think the real world evidence would suggest that you should be okay and that you shouldn't worry about your response to vaccine. Obviously, there's not direct data about Rebif and the COVID vaccines. Hopefully one day there will be, but based on the data we have so far about Rebif and other vaccines, I don't think you need to panic.
Okay, good. Another question around this mRNA technology. Someone's wondering if any additional information can be provided related to using the mRNA technology for general MS research.
There was a paper recently published about using an mRNA type vaccine in the animal model of MS, which I wonder if that's what the question's about. Very interesting, very preliminary. I think it's a good starting point. Part of the issue is the animal model of MS is not really MS, and that's because we create that in the animal by creating a specific immune response in the animal, and we know exactly what the target is in the animal. In people, we don't know exactly what the immune target is. We've never found one specific target of the immune system in human MS. So the animal model is a good approximation, but it's not exactly analogous to what humans have. And I think it's very interesting, and as most research in animals, it will go through various iterations, and if that's promising, they may look into studying this in small numbers in people and seeing what happens. So I think it's a really interesting avenue of research, but it's still in the very early stages. So I think it's definitely something worth watching, but I can't tell you how it's going to pan out at the end of the day for people with MS. But I think any avenue that shows promise is really worth pursuing, and hopefully as time goes by, we'll see more information about that.
Great. Good insights. Another question from our French Facebook audience. Someone is on Gilenya and is allergic to penicillin, so they're asking if they should get the vaccine anyway.
I'm not aware that a penicillin allergy is a contraindication to vaccination. Typically, the only vaccine, so if you're allergic to any known components of a vaccine, that's one issue. And that would have been evident because you'd have presumably had an allergic reaction to a vaccine. The flu vaccine is not ideal for people with egg allergies, but as far as I'm aware, a penicillin allergy is not known to be a problem with this vaccine. If you're concerned, please chat with your MS provider. But as far as I'm aware, that allergy should not be a reason why you can't get a COVID vaccine.
Okay.
And
Great.
typically when you go for your vaccine, they will ask you about allergies. And if you have any anaphylactic type of allergies, they typically just keep you there a little bit longer to make sure you don't have any reaction to the vaccine. I got my vaccine and I have a peanut allergy, so they made me sit there for an hour.
Okay. Good to know. There are quite a few questions, and you did reference this a little bit in your presentation, but people are asking specific questions around the disease-modifying therapy they may be on, and questions around how long people should wait before getting their shot or between the vaccine and their infusion.
So in a perfect world where you get to decide when you get your vaccine, for most medications, you don't need to hold your medication at all. For that group of, so for Mavenclad and alemtuzumab, it would be ideal if you're about 6 months out from your last treatment before you're vaccinated, and at least 4 weeks until you get your next treatment after you're vaccinated. Now, if you're at least a few months out from your treatment and your number comes up for vaccination, and you obviously want to be vaccinated because you want to feel safe and secure and protected, that's okay. With the drugs like Ocrevus or ocrelizumab, ideally as far out as you can be from your last cycle, but there may be issues. You may have MS that's very active, and it may not be reasonable to wait that long before vaccination because the risks and benefits don't balance out. Again, at least a few months out from the dose would be ideal, and up to 4 weeks after you're vaccinated to restart. That being said, if the timing just doesn't work out despite everybody's best efforts, I would say still get vaccinated because I don't think we have as much control about getting vaccinated and the timing. Perhaps by the time it rolls out to the general population, there will be a bit more wiggle room about that, but I can appreciate people want to be vaccinated as soon as possible. And again, it's not as if being vaccinated a few months out from a treatment means you won't respond. We just know the percentage of people who mount the usual immune response is lower than if you were a few months further out from the dose.
Okay. Another Facebook audience member is saying there was a trial case where MS was forced into a flare-up after the dose. Are you familiar with this case, and can you tell us if it was fixed?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I know there was a patient in the AstraZeneca trial out of the UK who developed complications in the study. I wonder if that's what is being referenced.
Perhaps.
And I know that person developed an inflammatory event. And at first, the feeling was this was related to the vaccine. And then there was some question about whether the patient actually had multiple sclerosis. I'm not sure that scenario was fully resolved. I'm not aware of any case reports of someone developing a formal diagnosis of multiple sclerosis that was felt to be linked to the vaccine. That's a challenge, admittedly. And I think the best answers, like all our vaccine studies and registries, will come out as time passes. So far, I'm not aware of any reports of that being a known adverse event with the vaccine, but it's a challenging question, and I think that's what these registries are for.
Very fair. We have time for one, perhaps two more questions. Someone from our French Facebook audience is asking, are people living with MS more at risk for Guillain-Barré syndrome or myelitis post-COVID vaccine?
There's no evidence at the moment that these are complications of the vaccine. We know COVID itself has been associated with Guillain-Barré syndrome and some central nervous system complications. We don't yet have data that tells us people develop Guillain-Barré syndrome or transverse myelitis directly from the vaccine. There was a transverse myelitis in the AstraZeneca trial, but again, there's a lot of questions around that. So I can't really answer the question because that relationship has not been established. We know that people who develop viral illnesses can develop Guillain-Barré syndrome who otherwise are perfectly healthy, and almost any virus can do that. And certainly COVID has been linked to Guillain-Barré. But I'm not aware yet that there's data that shows that the vaccine causes Guillain-Barré syndrome. And again, these are things that are watched for in the registries.
Okay, maybe we'll make this our final question to wrap things up for tonight. Someone indicates they're not currently in Canada and are in their 70s with secondary progressive MS. They'll only have access to AstraZeneca vaccine. What are your thoughts on this, even though it hasn't been approved yet in Canada?
It's a challenging question. I think their country's guidelines are probably what they should be following. And that's because the location they're in has more expertise and experience using the AstraZeneca vaccine. And those guidelines in your country have been developed with an understanding of the AstraZeneca rollout. Our Health Canada has not fully evaluated the vaccine yet, so I'm not sure I can speak from a Canadian perspective. I think if you've got a provider where you are, I think it's important conversation. Certainly, you have some risk factors for, having some struggles if you catch COVID. And if you're in a group that's been identified as somebody who should be getting the AstraZeneca vaccine, I think if you've got concerns, by all means, speak to your provider. They may be able to better give you some information, and that's because where you are has more experience using the AstraZeneca vaccine. But a lot of countries have spent a lot of time evaluating these vaccines. They haven't been rushed to market. What's really been speedy is a lot of the red tape that holds up approvals, but the actual studies and evaluations of the results haven't been rushed. So I think speak to your provider. I think hopefully they're able to reassure you that the plan for you is based on good evidence.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Burton. We'll leave it at that for questions for tonight, but I will let our audience know that we'll be going through all of the submitted questions to see how we can respond to those who might not have had a chance to touch on tonight. Again, I'd just like to take this opportunity to once again thank our speaker, Dr. Jody Burton. This is a very busy time for experts in this field, and we are so lucky that you've been able to take the time to share your expertise with us. I know that this has helped answer many questions and hopefully to alleviate many people's concerns as well. So thank you so very much again for your time, Dr. Burton.
Thank you for hosting me, and thank you for all your thoughtful questions. And I wish everybody to be well and safe. And hopefully we'll know more as the days go by, but stay well and don't panic.
Very good advice for all of us. So thanks again. Before we close, I'd just like to remind everyone that as we referenced before, information about COVID-19 and guidance regarding the vaccine can be found on our website at mssociety.ca. We will also soon be posting guidance on disease-modifying therapies and COVID-19 vaccines, which Dr. Burton referred to in her presentation. There are some great webinars coming up later this winter and spring. Our partners at Can Do MS in the United States offer monthly webinars, and on March 3rd, you can join them to learn about staying resilient to MS transitions. On April 20th and 21st, join the MS Society of Canada for the next session in our Hear from the Experts series, as we welcome Dr. Julie Petrin, who will help guide us through making sense of complex research. I also wanted to remind you about the MS Society of Canada's Knowledge Network, which is staffed by trained navigators to answer questions related to MS. You can see how to connect with them through phone, email, and live chat. Finally, webinars like this are critical to ensuring people living with MS have all of the information they need to make the best decisions for themselves. By registering and fundraising for MS Walk and MS Bike, you can help continue to make these sessions available, all while connecting with members of the MS community from across Canada. Visit mswalks.ca or msbike.ca to learn more. A final reminder that you will be receiving a survey following this webinar, and we encourage you to fill it out to let us know if this information was valuable to you. Again, a sincere thank you to Dr. Burton and to all of you for participating in today's webinar. Take care and have a good evening.